My primary goal here, though, I think that there's a conversation that's already taking place around the solar eclipse, and I want to add something to the conversation. And I don't want to just add it here. I also want to get it out there on the internet. So that's part of what Sam's doing. So we're going to collect up some of this and post it. What I want to bring to the conversation is that I think that this solar eclipse is peculiarly assigned to Israel. And by that, I mean the same thing as if I were to say it's assigned to Ephraim. And so then I want to go through some scriptural material in Genesis chapter 1 on the fourth day, because I want to talk about what a sign is. So here, this phase of the discussion, the solar eclipse as assigned to Ephraim, which is as much to say the solar eclipse is assigned to Israel in dispersion, all Israel. And so first about the solar eclipse as a sign, period. Just what's a sign? The basis for the fact that something that happens in the heavens can be a sign, that's in the fourth day. So if we open up the book of Genesis and we take a look at chapter 1, chapter 1 and verse 14 is where the fourth day begins. So verse 13, Vayi'er vayivoker yom shlishi, the third day is closed. Next day, Vayomer Elohim, and Elohim said, Yehi, let there be, or let exist, Me'orot birki hashamayim, in the lights in the firmament of the heavens. Lahavdil ben hayom uven halayla. Let them divide between the day and between the night. So Hebraically, the between in Hebrew occurs, like we would say in English, between and between, or betwixt and between. It is ben hayom uven halayla. That ben uven formula, that's the between the day and between the night. Then it says, Vehayu, they exist for, let them be. Our to be verb is the same idea as what's expressed here in Hebrew. Let them be leotot. So the first thing they are to be is aleph tav, sign. Okay? Ot. Let them be for otot, for signs, for seasons, for days, and for years. So leotot, lemoadim, appointments. We talked earlier today in connection with the Parsha about appointment and the tent of appointment. An appointment is something that's between people at a place at a time. Okay, and so moadim, appointments. Seasons is the way it's often translated. But appointments, so for signs, appointments, ulyamim, and for days, vishanim, and for years. So one of the things that can happen with these lights that move in the heavens, signs, otot, seasons, days, and years. Let them be for signs and for lights in the firmament of the heavens. Leha'ir al ha'aretz, to give light upon the earth, vayhichen, and it was so. Now we get to the doing. So the asa verb. Vayas Elohim, and Elohim did it. He made, he crafted, et shnei hameorot, 2 lights. 2 lights from which a lot of light comes. Hameorot hagedolim et hamaor hagadol. So big one and a little one, 2 great lights. Et hamaor hagadol, the great light. Lemenshelet hayom, for the day, to rule the day. Ve'et hamaor hakaton, the little light. Lemenshelet halayla, to rule the night. But then it says ve'et hakochavim, and also the kochavim, and also the stars. So there are fixed stars, as I was talking about earlier, and there are moving stars. So certain stars in certain arrangements in the expanse of the heaven at night, and then certain stars that move. There are 5 stars that are visible to the naked eye that move, and 2 great lights, the sun and the moon, that makes a total of 7 lights. The movement of these is intended to communicate something from God to man. That's the whole point about them being able to be signs. Okay, so I'm just saying the 4th day material posits to us that God is communicating through the things, the arrangements of the things in the heavens. The 7 lights that move against the background of fixed stars, and the fixed stars themselves all have something to say to us. So next, how this can be a sign. The kind of sign, primarily from my point of view, this particular sign is a tav. It has been talked about as an aleph. Just show of hands. How many of you have looked at a graphic image of the solar track of the last solar eclipse 7 years ago? It's not the last one, but it's the last one that we're referring to in reference to this subject. The solar eclipse of 7 years ago and this particular solar eclipse. Who's looked at a graphic of both laid over the United States? Okay, so the one 7 years ago, it came in over the coast of Oregon and it went out over the coast of South Carolina. So the solar eclipse begins way out, to the west in the Pacific. It ends in the Atlantic, and it's visible in different parts of the earth. One peculiarity about this sign is that there is a place that's in the area of totality. Then there is around that an area where you're near the area of totality and it looks pretty total. And gradually, the farther and farther away you get, the less and less visible it gets. And then there is a place where you're so far at the edge that even if you had equipment, like if you had a pair of binoculars with a welding lens or something that would keep you from injuring yourself, you could maybe tell that the moon was near the sun, but you could tell the whole disk of the sun is not interrupted, okay, by any part of the movement of the moon. Okay, and so an eclipse is such that the moon can come between the earth and the sun. That's what we're talking about, a solar eclipse, an eclipse of the sun. The earth can come between the sun and the moon. That would be a lunar eclipse. Blood moons happen whenever the earth nearly occludes the moon, but enough light goes through the atmosphere that you get a red color, just like at sunset. Sunrise and sunset, you have a reddish color because you're angling through a lot of air. That same thing. The light takes on a red cast and shines a red light on the moon, a blood moon. Does that make sense? Sometimes a blood moon occurs without any eclipsing of the moon. That's called a blood moon. All right, so in this case, we're talking about a solar eclipse. We're talking about one 7 years ago, and we're talking about this one, the one 7 years ago. The path of totality came across Oregon and left over South Carolina. The path of totality this time comes into the United States across Texas and goes out up by Maine and Canada, into Canada, okay? But similar thing. It comes from Pacific to Atlantic, generally speaking. But it has another peculiarity. The edge that you can just tell that the moon just touches the edge of the actual round disk of the sun. Ireland and Scotland both are in that area where it's barely touching. And let's say you were in London. In both cases, even though they're taking such a very different track, in both cases, just the difference between being in London and being in Scotland proper, let's say Edinburgh, gets you to the difference between no moon over the edge of the disk of the sun all the way to where you can actually see a little bit of a touch. Okay, that's odd. You wouldn't necessarily expect this sort of thing to work that way. As a matter of chance. And I think it's significant, and I think it's part of the quality of this thing as assigned to Ephraim, which I will get to a little more fully. If you look at if you look at the map of the United States, leaving out the general track all the way to the oceans, the beginning of totality until the end of totality, it looks like an X. If I'm primarily going to talk about it as a mark, Tav is a mark. Anciently, it looked like an X. It also had a form in some ancient documents like a plus sign. There are instances where it had a mark like a little letter T, what we would call a cross. And then, of course, there are variations of the modern form. But Tav is to mark as a verb, and it is a mark as a noun. Lots of Hebrew letters have a noun meaning, like Sheen, for instance, is tooth. Dalet is door, okay? So Tav also has a meaning. It means a mark. So it's an intersection, it's a sign, it's a mark, it can be a noun, and it has a verb form. All of that is the Hebraic scope of Tav. Ezekiel 9, chapter 4 now. And I'm going straight to this because I think it is important. I think it brings something to the conversation that I don't think is really out there. If it is, I haven't run into it. So in Ezekiel chapter 9, we find 6 men coming in to Jerusalem out of the way of the upper gate, looking toward the north. Every man with his destructive weapon in his hand, one man in their midst, clothed with linen, having a scribe's ink holder by his side. They came and stood beside the altar of bronze. The glory of Elohim, the kavod of Elohim of Israel, lifted itself up from off the keruv on which it had been into the threshold of the house. He called to the man clothed with linen, who had the writing kit by his side. Now we're at the 4th verse. Then said Yahuwah unto him, Pass along through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and set thou a mark upon the foreheads of the men who are sighing and crying over all the abominations that are being done in her midst. It reads in Hebrew, Vayomer Yahuwah Elohav, Avor betoch ha'ir, in the midst of the city, betoch Yerushalayim, in the midst of Jerusalem. And here's the operative words. Vehitvita tav. The tuv of Vehitvita and the tav are tav a tav. Okay? Mark a mark. On the foreheads of the men that sigh and cry for all the abominations that are done in the midst of there. So mark a mark, tav a tav on them. The verb is tava. It's an identifying mark an identifying mark. 1 Samuel chapter 21. There we find David. He's fled from Jerusalem, and he is pretending madness. He's pretending to be insane in order to deal with the tactical situation that he's in. And it says, you may have in your translation something like he scrabbled on the door, or he scribbled on the door, or he marked on the door, or whatever. This same verb is used there to indicate that he marked or scribbled. He marked up the door to the king's, the door of the gate, the door to the king's palace, I suppose, as I take it. So it can be, I'm talking about usages of the verb now, tava, to mark. It can be an intelligible mark. It can be an unintelligible mark. You see the range there? It doesn't have to necessarily be a mark that has significance or meaning, but it definitely is included in its meaning. It can be a mark that has significance or meaning, like we would say in English. It can be a sign. It can be a signification. Okay, and then also I want to talk about Job. I don't know if I put that into my notes, but in Job 31, I think, there's a point where he's saying, I make my mark. He's in this conversation with God. He's saying, I'm making my identifying mark. And so just like someone who was, you might consider illiterate, makes their X because they don't have a signature or a scribble. So one of the things that people used to do was they didn't have a signature like we sign our name. They had a mark, and they might go and put a little certain kind of curlicue or whatever. They had a thing they did with the pen that was their mark. If they weren't literate enough to have one of those, then they made an X, which is a tav. All right. Nowadays, if there's a line for you to sign, there'll be an X. All of that, it all relates back to the history of tav. And you can have an individual signifying mark. That can be your tav, in other words. You can make an X, you can make, some kind of a mark, you could sign your name. It's a signature. That's the idea that's in Job. I'm making my unique identifying mark. And so that's worth considering as well. Now, tava has also, outside of that range, it has a separate usage. In this sense, it's often considered a separate verb, but it's really not separate. It's really the same verb. Okay, so it has a different Strong's number, but it means it's the same letter set, and the verb is constructed the same way. It just is used to do enough different meaning that the commentator felt that we should have it's like this is a different thing. Okay, and it's not precisely so much a different thing. It can be to vex or to cause pain. So idiomatically, in English, someone might say regarding a person stabbing or burning someone, he marked him. That's the Hebraic idiom. Okay? Do you understand what I'm saying? Vexed, marked, it's that range of idea. It can mean to limit or to restrain what a person can do. All right? You can mark out a limit within which someone can act. Does this make sense, what I'm talking about? All that is different applications of the idea of tava. To tav a tav, then to mark a mark, you can use it to say limit. You can use it to say vex. You can say cause pain. You can say make an identifying mark. You can say scribble. Okay, that's the range, and I'm trying to convey to you, and in Hebrew, the same expression expressed one time in one instance, that same expression can mean more than one thing. That's a familiar idea, right? So just because you have a meaning, it doesn't mean there can only be one meaning. Hebraically, there can be more than one meaning. And I would just say this, I think everything I've talked about related to tava and tav, I think is relevant to this particular sign. I think there's an application for vex. I think there's an application for limit. Okay? I think there's an application for cause pain. I think there's an application for specific identifying mark. I think there's an application for mark. Job 31:35. You should have something like, see my mark, something like that. And a person's identifying mark, their signature. Psalm chapter 78 and verse 41. Whenever Israel turned from God, they caused him pain. But at the same time, and I don't think this is generally brought out in the translation, they limited his blessing. God had a heart that he wanted to bless Israel, and in this application of the word tava, they're causing God pain by treating God the way they are, the people of Israel, but they also are putting limits on what he's going to do in the way of blessing because of their disobedience. You see what I'm saying? So we can take these ideas, we can see how different applications of the same idea, there's some application for it in the framework of the text. Okay? Fair enough? So, do you feel like I've made at least a beginning case for the fact that there can be a sign in the heavens that if you take this thing as an X, you can dig around and satisfy yourself, about the data set that I'm talking about. But I have here, I think, a cohesive data set that says this could be understood as a tav, pointed at America or at the Western world or something, and I'm going to say, I think what it's pointed at primarily is Israel and dispersion. All Israel, the whole house of Israel, not just Jewish people. In fact, I would say primarily North Kingdom people who are scattered in dispersion. And I'll try to make that case as we go along. But at this point, I want to stop and ask if there are any questions about something that happens in the heavens being a sign. The sign as Aleph and Tav, Ot, X's, pluses, crosses, marks, different significations out of that framework that I just laid out.